conference board in New York City on December 11th of 2001, and I'm here with Victor Zarnowitz. And I've asked Victor to begin at the beginning and end at the end, but where he sees the beginning is wherever he wants to begin it, and I'm willing to begin at whatever beginning he wants. So thank you, Victor.
Well, let me begin at when I came to New York.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the last of January in 1952.
Mm-hmm.
I came from Heidelberg, Germany, where I spent some time studying economics, getting PhD, and primarily waiting for the US visa, which took a while. And took enough time for me to finish there. If you compare it, for example, with fate of others, Jacob Mintzer, for example, a good friend of mine, also from the National Bureau, he came earlier because he didn't have my problem. He was in Germany longer, and I came from Russia. And there was a law called McCarran-Walter Act, I believe.
Right.
That made it difficult for people who came from Russia at the time to get to the U.S. Right, something like that, right? And but that was revoked, right, in the Congress, and then I could go. And instead of studying in U.S. as Jacob did, for example, in Emory and so on, I studied in Heidelberg, which wasn't so pleasant given my past, but I was all right. There was a whole group of students, mostly in medicine, and I was the only one in economics at that time in Heidelberg. I got a PhD there. Then I came to New York, and my first job, and still my association, it was with the National Bureau of Economic Research, which was at that time at the Columbus Circle, the place where there is today the convention hall, a big tall tower there. And I just looked for a job, and by, I believe, mid-May, about 10 weeks after I came to New York, I got a job at the National Bureau.
So you had not heard about the National Bureau?
Oh, I heard about the National Bureau. I knew, that's why I came there, of course.
But were you in contact with Burns or with...
I was not not before I got the job. And I got the job not with Moore or Burns, not in business cycles, but in a study of mergers by Gideon Rosenbluth, a Canadian economist then in New York, and still a very good friend of mine. And I was working on that project, and I applied for a research scholarship at the Social Science Research Council. And about a year after I came to New York, we moved for a year, for an academic year, to Harvard, where I had this postdoctoral research training fellowship, it was called, of the Social Science Research Council. But then after that academic year at Harvard, where I studied with Samuelson and Solo and Leontiev and other great names, I came back to the Bureau. I was very attached to the Bureau, even, after only a year of working there. I liked the atmosphere. I liked very much the place. The kind of work that they did appealed to me. Largely empirical, but I believe it's not quite correct to say there was largely empirical. I think that they always aspired to some general theoretical advances. well, that's sometimes difficult to get, but they were working on it. I believe that Mitchell's 1913 book, which was kind of the beginning of the study of business cycles a la Bureau. He was, after all, the founder of the Bureau. I missed him, by the way, because he died shortly before I arrived. But I believe that it's not right and not fair to claim that his work was empirical and not theoretical. Although some people, even at the Bureau, would subscribe to it. Probably George Stigler would. Anyway, I found the atmosphere and the type of work very appealing. I was interested in business cycles much earlier. At Heidelberg, my professor Erich Preiser wrote a little book on the theory of business cycles. Was very interested in that. So
what was your PhD? I'll call it a dissertation. It wouldn't have been
my
called
dissertation
a
was my dissertation. It was a doctoral Schrift, as they call it, and it was published as a book in Heidelberg, and it was on the theory of income distribution. So it was not on business cycles, or not directly on it. Theorie der Einkommensverteilung in German, Entwicklung und heutiger Stand, which means development and the present state. So I had already something, but I had to start anew, in a sense. At the Bureau, I was just a research assistant there for a while. But I worked with Gideon and found that interesting as well. But it was not my field. It was, I went to Harvard for a year. When I came back, I had a paper, my first paper in English, was actually on input-output theory and
published in the Review of Economic Studies.
Right.
In '61.
That's right.
Right. But
well, I'm impressed that you know that much.
But what's interesting is that you did that research during that
at
very
Harvard.
nice, I think, fertile year of 53,
Right.
54.
Right.
And then did some editors say, do this, do that, and it took until 61 to get it published, or did you just work on it?
I think it was published earlier. I don't know exactly when.
I think it was 61.
Really, I
read
have
it.
to find.
Yeah.
Right. It was on. Well, then it took a long
took a
time,
little
perhaps.
time.
Right. But I didn't realize that it was that late. All right. But it was written. This paper in the Review of Economic Studies was written at Harvard.
And you thanked the people who were there.
Right.
And so I put it together that, of course, that came out of the year of 53.
Right. But I came back to I think 61 I wrote, wasn't 61 I think on forecasting at the Bureau. Anyway, we can check it with
You
my.
know what, Victor, I could be wrong.
I think you are probably wrong. I don't think it took that long. No.
Okay.
I don't think it took long. I submitted it probably before I came back to the Bureau, and it didn't take that long, no.
Okay.
But anyway, after I came back to the Bureau, I worked with Fels, not Rendix Fels. He was also at the Bureau, and I had some thing with him. But it was for a while that I worked with a guy from Berkeley in fiscal policy. What's his name? Again, I have to look it up. Maybe I should do it now.
Sure, I can turn this off.
Because it will be probably better.
We're back. I just want to correct something, which is that Victor's review of economic studies paper was 1956, and so we're reconstructing the Zarnowitz Bureau history. Okay, Victor.
Well, after I came back from Harvard in 1954, 53, 54, the academic year, I was at Harvard on a postdoctoral research training fellowship of the Social Science Research Council. And I spent that year working at Samuelson Seminar, Leontief Seminar. These were the two main centers of my study, and out of the Leontief Seminar came this paper, which was my first English publication, on causes and consequences of changes in general equilibrium system, review of economic studies, June 1956. So I came back at the Bureau. I worked for a short while on fiscal problems with two professors from Berkeley, but very soon I shifted to business cycles and stayed in that area ever since. I became an assistant to Jeffrey Moore, who was the associate director of research at the National Bureau, and whose area of study, of course, was business cycles. Now, I worked first at a book, a two-volume book edited by Jeffrey Moore on business cycle indicators. And I contributed 3 chapters to this book. One chapter on cyclical aspects of incorporations and the formation of new business enterprise. The second one on cyclical changes in business failures and corporate profits, and that was co-authored with Lionel Lerner, the son of Abba Lerner, who was at the Bureau at the time. And finally, the third of these papers, and the one that I spend most time on, is the timing of manufacturers' orders during business cycles. So these 3 chapters in business cycle indicators of Jeffrey Moore was my first contribution to the to business cycles. But even before then, I worked for a while with Ruth Mack at the Bureau, and the outcome was an article in the American Economic Review, which I co-authored with Ruth Mack, entitled Cause and Consequence of Changes in Retailers' Buying. It was Ruth's initiative, and she sort of co-opted me for this project. And in that paper, she developed, or she continued to develop, the concept of what she called subcycles, and what we would call today growth cycles, probably, or maybe slowdowns and so on. This is a concept of changes that are more visible in growth rates or in detrended values than in levels.
Where on your CV is the Brusmak paper?
It's on page 8 in the complete
it's on
one.
the short
Right.
articles.
No, it's on the. It's not a short article. It's on the books and articles, and but it's early, so it is, and it goes in the reverse time order. So
Right.
that was published in March 1958 in the AER.
Can you put your finger on it on your copy? There it is. No, that's the business cycle. Oh, that's the one with Brusmak.
All right. You have it?
It's not on this one.
Oh, maybe that's a shorter.
It's okay.
Well,
I think it's a shorter one. That's why. Mine.
Huh.
It's okay.
It's not shown there somehow.
That was mine.
All right.
Okay.
But on that I worked with Ruth.
Second. So don't worry.
And
Yeah.
in a sense, it was also in business cycles, if you want.
Right.
Right.
So by then
But-
you were a visiting assistant professor at Columbia and
Right.
a lecturer, and I take it that that was through Burns must have introduced you to the
No,
faculty.
I don't think so. I don't think that Burns was involved in this one. It was Victor Fuchs,
Yes.
who you should, by the way, also interview.
Oh, of course,
Right.
I will interview Victor. when I get out to
Because
California.
Victor was my namesake, right? Victor
Yes.
was at the School of General Studies, and that's where I was teaching
Yes.
part-time, and so was he. So it was Columbia University School of General Studies,
Yes.
and I'm not sure what what I was teaching exactly there, but it was economics clearly, and it was macroeconomics probably. Okay, so that was through Victor Fuchs. Okay.
So you would,
But
you
I
would
w- I
go
was-
up there to teach part-time, you'd come
Right.
down to the bureau and work
Right.
on these various projects.
Well, I was somehow full-time at the bureau,
Right.
so in part-time at Columbia. So Columbia was definitely sort of. I devoted much less time to it compared with the bureau. In the bureau, I was full-time.
Tell me about much of the work that you were doing after you came back from Harvard. Of course, you worked with Ruth Mack, but much of it appears to be the work that was on business cycles
Right.
that came out in these volumes that Jeff Moore edited.
I think less than a year after I came back from Harvard, I started working with Jeff
Right.
at the bureau, right? And I was his assistant, but I must say, very early he gave me a chance to work on my own. And the first chance he gave me was connected with a book he was writing or editing. I mean, he has contributions to that book as well as editorship. And he just let me do what I was interested in. He suggested what indicators I should look at. He was interested in the leading indicators. I mean, he revived the work of Burns and Mitchell, or rather Mitchell and Burns, that went back, I believe, to the first effort in indicators at the Bureau was in 1937-38, when Secretary of Treasury Morgenthau asked them to construct a list. And they did, and it was a list of leading indicators of recovery, because they were waiting for a recovery in 37.
Right.
It was a relapse, from the Great Depression. And then the second effort was actually Moore. And Moore by that time had an occasional paper already on the leading indicators, and that was more general because it referred to both recoveries and recessions. And then he wrote this, or edited this book of business cycle indicators. It's in 2 volumes. The first volume is text, and second volume is data, a collection of data, small, of indicators. And I was working on that book at the Bureau.
So at the Bureau, the Business Cycle Project was an extremely large part of the Bureau. There were many research assistants
That's
who were
right.
working, and there was...
Well, I don't know many. I mean, the whole
Some.
Bureau was not that big. Right.
But
Right.
but there was sort of a protocol that you used. Can you talk about what people have referred to, and Bob Lipsey claims that he still has a mimeographed sheet about the protocol. I don't think this is apocryphal, about the protocol that one used in taking a series and looking at it in terms of business cycles.
Well, the protocol for business cycles was really a big book, and that was Measuring Business Cycles by Burns and Mitchell. There was a kind of a Bible of business cycle procedures, and there were additional materials. There was no computer, but there was a calculator. It was a Frieden calculator we worked on. We ran regressions. We calculated regressions, for example, on that manual calculator, which was a very time-consuming and sort of tedious work, but it helped to understand it, from ground up. I think what, for example, a regression means, or multiple regression, and many people think that this was very helpful, although, as I say, tedious, and so we did that, but we followed the procedures in general of measuring business cycles. But the procedures are different from today's computer procedures, for computerized procedures, very different. They allowed, I think, for a much larger role of judgment.
Right.
For example, the turning point programs that were developed, they existed later, and again, they didn't exist at that time yet. And so it was done largely by judgment, but by trained judgment backed by a lot of experience after a while. We worked with so many time series. And I find today that I do the same thing. I get a turning point list from the computer, and I never accept it as it stands. I always looked at the chart, because that's what we have done then, and that's what I'm used to. Without a chart or a time series, I'm not going to do anything. I have to look at the chart. The chart is after seasonal adjustment, and we look at the quality of seasonal adjustment too. We paid a good deal of attention to it. And then we looked at, now we look at the turning points designated by the computer, and sometimes we overrule the computer. For example, the computer, even though it is instructed in the Berry-Beauchamp procedures to do more or less what we did before, it doesn't always do it exactly. If there is a plateau, for example, or if there are two competing turning points, peaks or troughs, if they are alike, we were told to take the latter one, the later one of the two. The computer will not always do that. The previous one may be slightly higher and will be taken by the computer. Will tend to take the later one. Right. For example, this is just an illustration. And that's how we proceeded. In fact, we had these rules, but we used our judgment. The rules themselves might have been overruled. Right. If that seemed to be the best choice. But we always worked together. So, for example, there was a perhaps unwritten rule, but much followed, where when we made this kind of a decision, somebody else independently also did it. We invited somebody to do it. And we spent a ridiculous amount of time sometimes on discussing these decisions when we disagreed. Right. But I think that it was probably justified. At least I like to think.
Did you go back to the earlier data on business cycles to, Burns, Mitchell, others had worked through the older data, and you were then picking up and sort of adding to it. Did you ever go back to the older stuff and say, what would I have done?
Very recently I did something similar.
Yes.
What I did here is to look at our so-called index of composite index of coincident indicators, of which there are 4. There was personal income, real personal income, less transfer payments, manufacturing and trade sales, again adjusted for inflation, industrial production, the index of industrial production, and non-farm employment from establishment survey. The combination of these four is the coincidence index, and I wanted to see how all the dates of the NBER hold up after many revisions that were made in some of these series. Not as many as in GDP, but there are revisions. And I looked at GDP as well. And there are deviations, even though the dates are not revised, but they are not very serious as far as coincidence index is concerned. The only serious one was a lead of 6 months, I believe a lead. The rest is all zeros, that means exactly coincident, or plus minus 1 or 2 months, so that's sort of negligible. There was one large one. In GDP, there were 3 leads of 1 quarter each, which I don't know, how they arise, but must be due to revisions, because we looked at both this monthly coincidence index and at GDP as well, or GNP at that. Anyway, so it's holding up pretty well, but not exactly as. And I have my doubts whether the present data are better than the judgment then made by what I would like to think were skilled observers. And because that could be due, for example, to the deflators, the new chain indexes. Why that should matter 40 years back, I'm not sure. Why that should mean rewriting history, in a sense. But I simply don't know. That is an interesting subject of study, for study.
And did you, when you're working at the Bureau and thinking about sort of the broad sweep of business cycles, and of course that's what Mitchell did. He and others sort of tried to push the envelope of data for the U.S.,
right.
Push it back into the 19th century, way back into the 19th
right.
century. Did you?
And earlier, except that the earlier ones are not monthly.
Right. Did you sort of hold this stuff in your hands, in your head, and say, aha, this is how I would tell the story of the American economy using these business cycles? Now I see. Did you ever have one of these eureka moments when you say, aha, now I understand? Or did you always say, business cycles are difficult, they're unique, there are some aspects that are similar, but we're not going to do a very good job at telling the history of an economy on the basis of these business cycles? How did you view that?
I think, they are different. They are complicated, but there are common threads, there are common elements. And I'm convinced myself that these guys, well, I didn't know Mitchell, I know him only from reading, but I knew Burns pretty well. I was very kind of happy, even proud, I must say, when he asked me once, he said he has written himself out on Mitchell, and he asked me to write about Mitchell for the International Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, which I did, and I'm convinced that they wanted a general theory of business cycles, that they tried to move in this direction, but they were extremely cautious. They thought that it doesn't come first, that it comes much later, after they accumulate a lot of knowledge about what happened during business cycles, as Mitchell's one of Mitchell's books is entitled "What Happens During Business Cycles." So they wanted to know that and develop an empirically sound somehow, and validated, and something that can be validated with the data, a theory of this kind. But they certainly believed that while they differ, that they have common elements, and they wanted to concentrate on the common elements. They were they were explicit about it. And I think that, if you read them closely and correctly, you'll get this impression. Particularly from Mitchell. I mean, in measuring business cycles, they may have gone too far, in going into great detail, and losing what seems almost a loss of the sight of the general theory of business cycles. But that was, if they did it, it was nothing. It was against the intention rather than,
Right.
In 1913, he was very explicit on that.
Right.
I believe.
A couple of questions for you about the people who were there and what you thought of them, what your interactions were. Let me begin with Arthur Burns, who led the Bureau from, 47 until 67, with one small year or two when he was at the council.
Well, he was mostly elsewhere. I mean, when I was at the Bureau, Moore ran the things with others, but and Burns was absent. Generally.
Burns was absent.
Burns was mostly absent.
Well, of course,
And
for the time that you were there was a long time when he was at the council.
Right.
So he was truly absent.
He was truly absent.
And in fact, then.
I don't mean that he was absent in the sense that he would be around and neglected someone. No, I don't think that. But he was absent. He was in Washington. He was in Washington.
But
and that made a big deal of difference.
He comes back. I
Right.
think when you come back from your year at Harvard, he comes back.
He comes back, right? And when he came back, he was active. He was always an active guy. I was never bothered somehow by that, but some people were very, very much by his kind of presence, and I know that Ruth was. I mean, it was interesting.
Ruth was bothered by Arthur.
She was bothered by Arthur.
In what way?
I saw her crying once.
Really?
Right.
Because
Burns could be very, very sharp and difficult.
Right.
In meetings and so on. Now, of course, I was young at first. I didn't participate in all these meetings, But I saw her crying, yes, and she complained that he was not rude, but extremely difficult, giving them to understand his superiority, and inferiority, and something to that effect. As I say, this is second-hand for me. I never had it with him. But from Ruth, I know that for sure.
Did you ever hear anything about Burns's and Kuznitz's problems?
Yeah, I heard about the conflict, but again, I don't have any first-hand knowledge of it.
But what did you hear?
That they were not good with each other, and I heard it simply in the context of how difficult Burns was, But I don't know the detail. I learned about the detail and so on much later.
You knew
So
Simon.
Oh, I knew him, of
Yes.
course, yes. I knew him. I cannot say I knew him very well. I knew him because, among others, he worked on business cycles as well. He helped quite a bit, before in measuring business cycles, and later, and still earlier in seasonal variations. All of that was one package, in a sense.
He did the seasonal
All right. So I knew him from that. I think that not everybody is very comfortable with national income accounts. I am not myself, I must say. So, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the critics. I think I deplore the fact, for example, that the government statistical agencies neglect other things to devote almost all the time to national income accounts. Uh, I think that for some purposes, for example, dating business cycles, national income accounts are inferior for two reasons. They are quarterly, and then they are also subject to long strings of revisions that are not always very clear, you know, where they lead to or what, how they are justified and all of that. It's not always clear to me that they are improvements. So maybe that was behind this conflict with Kuznets.
Well, my sense that is exactly yours. That some of the conflict was personality. That Burns was just
Yeah, Burns
somewhat
had a
difficult.
kind of overbearing
I think that another
personality.
part was that I believe Simon wanted to move the Bureau in the direction of thinking more about growth and development. He wanted to broaden the Bureau, and the Bureau's mandate was to study the United States. I think Burns made that very clear to Simon. And Simon had, before you came to the U.S., Simon had put in for funds, I think, through the Ford Foundation to do this study of multi-country, which he, of course, did.
Yeah.
And Burns would not have it in the Bureau. So I think part of it was that.
Right.
We'll never know.
Right. Even today, there, you know, there's
Right.
people who say, I think Martin himself would stress that it is a national, not international Bureau of Economic Research.
Yes, yet we have Japan in there, we have Germany in there, that when there's a way of getting in, Marty now has these relationships, very important relationships with India, China,
Yeah.
now it's going to be Cuba. So we're
And speaking for myself, for example, we here at the conference board now are working, and that's why I joined the conference board, on these international indicators and composite indexes. I wish there would be some kind of link with the National Bureau on that. But I didn't pursue it yet. I was told by Bob Hall that it is indeed a National Bureau, not the International Bureau of Economic Research. So maybe this is not that old and past, this whole notion. Yes, there is more the departure in the international direction, but still not enough as far as I'm concerned.
I think you're absolutely right. When Anna and Milton were working on a monetary history, you saw Anna because she was there. I think she had an office at the Bureau from '53, so it would have been when you got
I
back.
saw Anna and saw from time to time Milton as well, of course, right?
Yes.
But when I went to Chicago, it was George Stigler who told me, asked me whether I would go, and I went. Even though George did not work at all in my area, in business cycles, right? And was rather suspicious of the whole thing. But
I think he was always suspicious
Right,
of the whole.
right.
Yes, I think you're right.
right,
But he wanted to build Chicago.
Right.
He wanted to attract very good talent.
that's right. And Milton, of course, was in Chicago already, and he was interested in business cycles very much. Though I must say, I never, I admired the effort and the results to a large extent in monetary history, but I was never persuaded that this is the clue to business cycles.
That it was what?
That this is the main, this is the core or the clue to the business cycles.
Yes. So did you talk with Anna about?
Maybe to some extent. I don't remember. Probably not a lot.
Right.
Probably not a lot. But
of course, I don't want to defend all of the monetary history of the United States, but much of if you take, for example, the chapter on the greatest business cycle of them all, the chapter on the Great Contraction, their point is that other forces were getting us down, so that there was, I think it's in August of 29, or no, it's July of 29, there's a business cycle downturn. Then in October of '29, the stock market
All right.
crash. And that would have, all of the events up until then and beyond would have gotten us down pretty far. And then the contraction of the money supply, boom,
Right.
brings us to the bottom. So they're not denying.
No, they are not denying other forces, no. They're much too good for that. Right, but I mean, well, others, it so often happens, some followers want to go further than the originators.
Right.
So, there was a good deal of writing business cycle history in the monetarist sense and direction, and more exclusively monetary things. And they probably some people went further in that direction than Milton and Anna would do.
Right.
But it was nevertheless probably their influence. Anyway, you asked me whether I sort of collaborated on that. I must say no.
Yeah. But in discussions, I'm trying to get a sense of, in the Bureau, it's a small organization, you're working in part by yourself, in part with Jeff Moore, maybe Sol Fabricant a bit. There are other people around. Do you get together, you have lunch together?
Oh, yeah.
You have the Brown Bag Seminar.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, that was very open, and of course it was a small place, and the relations were in general good. There were some conflicts, of course, but I didn't experience that directly, and I went along very well with Jeff in particular, and I worked more closely with him than with others, and I think the good thing about the Bureau was precisely the freedom that they gave to people if they thought that they deserve it, that they will make good use of that freedom. And there may have been, of course, there probably were cases, the opposite cases, where say a research assistant stayed research assistant forever, but that will probably happen in every organization. But I think there was an interest in developing people, in letting people do work on their own. At least this was my experience, definitely.
Just about everyone who was at the Bureau at that time, and I think through till today, says the same thing about the Bureau.
That's good. Yeah, and that was probably among the best features of the Bureau. Now, in discussions, for example, of course, people differ, as you know, and some are very strong, and some are simply more timid or not so good at that. So it was probably good, not so easy for younger people, beginners in this kind of work, to say make themselves heard against people like Burns and Friedman, for example, who are both, Friedman is a debater, kind of. I don't know whether you know him from this side. He is, so it's not so easy. It's not so easy, and sometimes was difficult. We wrote, I remember, with Jacob Mintzer, Jacob Mintzer edited a book on economic forecasts and expectations. You may know it. And we have a joint paper there, Jacob and I. And, I did, on the whole, I continued to work in this area. That was, for him, a single departure. And Roseanne Cole contributed, and so on. And at the Bureau, there were always staff readings, you know that. I mean, anything that was to be published and so on went through staff review. And that's remarkable because, there were no outsiders, and you worked with these people, and they, had to pass judgment on your work. So I remember that Milton Friedman read our paper, the paper with Jacob. And in one case, he wrote on the margin, nonsense, with a with a exclamation or maybe more than one exclamation mark. Well, we looked at that. We didn't find it, and I still don't think it was nonsense at all. It was a disagreement between his view and ours. So that was, that was a byproduct of the work at the bureau. You had to be prepared for this kind of thing. Of course, you could oppose, but you had to pay attention to that.
Who were the other people who were coming through, let's say, from 54 until 59?
But there were many
Because
people.
at 59 you leave and you go to Chicago.
Right.
So.
But I left.
54
I was
50.
still very, very often in New York,
Very often,
and
yeah.
I worked with the bureau from
Who
Chicago.
were the other people who you look back on those years and
There was a guy, again, I have to look up the annual reports to remember the
Right.
names and so on. There's a guy at MIT, you may know him,
What does he do?
in fiscal, I knew him very, very well, but it's years ago. And he didn't work in my area, but we were neighbors. I was a neighbor also of the guy who is now lives in Garden City, Long Island. I must look up the
Okay, well,
text
whatever,
and so on.
some
I didn't
names come,
have a
some
chance yet.
names don't.
So many names will come back
Many.
when I
Yes.
see, and I may
They
have something
come
to say.
back in 3 minutes, who knows?
Right. The guy I mentioned from Long Island was
Yeah.
also, worked on.
You just say what
Worked
it was
on-
and I can find it out, yeah.
That was my neighbor. He also worked, I think, on concentration. Right. Right.
Well, I
But
should
maybe
have
my
brought-
other thing.
I should have brought the publication.
Right. I mean
It's okay.
I didn't work with him directly, but he was my neighbor. I will remember many of these things. I'm sorry for my memory of names. That definitely deteriorated somewhat. I don't remember names, but I will recall.
And of course, Jacob
I-
would appear. Mincer, he would
Yeah,
be there.
I worked with him.
Right.
Sure.
And Stigler.
And Stigler, I didn't work with Stigler, but he knew
No, I mean,
about
but
me.
people
He
would-
asked me to go to Chicago, so he must have known me
But he.
pretty
but
well.
you
In
must
fact,
have
when
seen
I
him
came
there.
when I
Yeah.
came to New York, I remember I had an interview with Gideon, who hired me, but also with Jeff Moore and with. And with George Stigler.
Yes.
With George
What are your
Stigler.
recollections of Stigler?
My recollections
And I mean,
are more
from
from
that
Chicago,
period, but
right?
yes,
Not
of
from,
course, it's hard.
not that much from the bureau
Yes.
because we didn't work together,
Right.
but of course much more from Chicago, and I knew him very well there. And he was tough, just like Friedman was, and Burns, in different ways. In very different ways. Not personally, but demanding, expecting a lot, and
George also had a great sense of humor.
oh yeah,
And a great sense of irony and sarcasm, and which Milton
no, Milton
would
didn't
not
have it. No,
do that. No.
no.
I
And
used
he
to
was
go to George's lectures. I did I.O. and I went to George's lectures, and sometimes I would just go for the jokes.
yeah, he was great at it, right? And he tried to be fair, but he had strong opinions. They all had strong opinions. Extremely strong opinions.
Right.
That may have been a little bit on the negative side to some extent. It's not good to be so opinionated, but strong opinions prevailed at the bureau. There is no question about it.
Right.
and they differed among individuals, of course.
So, is there anything else you want to say about the period at the Bureau up until when you, and I will still say left to go to Chicago, because you did leave, even though you came back very long?
I came back, but of course I left. I was not present physically, and that makes a difference.
Right.
Where you are, of course.
So you were sad to go?
I was sad to go, but I was, I wanted to teach. I knew that this should be advantageous for me. And
But in
wasn't
addition,
it?
up
And it
until
was,
then,
and it was.
you were still a, your title was a research assistant rather than,
No, I think it was associate.
it was associate.
All right. I think I was, I don't remember when it started, but I was on the, they had this list of
Right.
people on the,
Right.
on the covers, and
And at some point
yeah,
you
of course,
become
yeah,
part of it.
right. I was
Right.
picked up for it, right. But I don't remember exactly when. But all of that is
Right.
could be easily checked with
No,
annual
it's-
reports,
it's
right?
Absolutely. Now,
I just don't remember.
1959.
Probably not very long. My
Right.
impression is that maybe two years after I came back,
Right.
3 years, probably no longer than that. I was working with Moore at the same time as assistant, and I was already working on my own stuff, so it was not so very clear.
I
I know
think
what
that
it
Bob
was.
Lipsy said as well when I spoke to him, and Bob was just a research assistant. And of course, you would have known Bob Lipsy.
Oh, yes, of
because
course
he
I
was
knew.
there
I
to
knew.
talk about Bob.
Right.
Right.
No, I
And
knew.
He was, he was, I will say, sort of more of a kid because he didn't have a PhD yet. He had, and so
Yeah.
therefore he was sort of a research assistant.
Right.
Yeah.
But there was not, and that was a good thing. I don't think that there was a sense of very strict hierarchy and so
Well,
on.
that-
Maybe with some
so
people
talk
like
to that. That's an important thing.
Burns, maybe more, but certainly not Moore, for example. I would say that Moore was very good at that, at delegating or at picking up people and letting them do their own work. And that was my experience, because he was my boss after I came back. And I didn't have it with Rosenbluth and with the guys from Berkeley, but this is because they themselves were sort of visitors, temporary, thing. But Moore was, of course, on the staff. And as soon as I started working for him, very soon after that, I worked on these 3 papers, And it's maybe difficult to say for a while whether I was research assistant or research associate, but it was fluid, and that came very fast. So my experience was that they let you work on your own, regardless of where you had your PhD and where all of that, and regardless of your English. Of course, you were expected to write, so you had to be good enough in English, But it wasn't so difficult, at least
So
not for
in
me.
'59, you get this offer. It's a very good offer, right, from the University of Chicago. It's a business school.
Right. It was for associate professorship,
Associate.
not assistant,
At
because I was
Columbia.
already assistant professor at Columbia. So and
so this
and I
was-
was 40
so this
years
was
of
with-
age. So
with
it was right.
It was
When
with
I
tenure?
in my farewell party, Stigler and Zellner gave talks, which I couldn't wish for better people, and I of course had to reply. And in my reply, I stressed the fact that I was already 40, and I came to Chicago, and I came as an associate professorship, with tenure. No, tenure I got 2 years later.
Yes.
Right, 2 or 3 years later, something like that. Anyway, and that in many places, it wouldn't be so obvious that you'll get there at this age, and with my background, which was not fully American and so on. And that I think that this is a positive feature of Chicago, that they were open enough to do that. And I think it was well received, and it was meant. It was honestly, sincerely meant as a kind of a counter compliment to all of that.
It was the beginning of one of the absolutely grand moments in the history of the University of Chicago.
Right.
Economics.
But it was similar, so I was lucky both at the Bureau and at Chicago, and in a combination. Because at the Bureau it was very similar. And they were open, and they accepted me for what I was worth, and gave me a chance to work on my own. It's true that I had a PhD and all of that. They wanted me back in Germany, and of course I didn't. I say of course, but I mean you will understand it probably. But my German professor, particularly his docent Kreller, they didn't like it because he said that I answered it too quickly. But of course, after all of that, all my experiences in Europe was obvious. I wanted to be in the States, and I felt well in the States. So I answer not so quickly and very politely that, but in the negative. There was an opening in Regensburg that the prize I wanted me to go.
This is sort of off the point,
But,
but I just wanted to know. So you moved to Chicago, your wife, your two
Yeah.
sons. The south side of Chicago is a was not a very pleasant place in certain respects. It was the university was the grandest place, but Hyde Park
Yeah,
was a little dangerous.
right.
And how did you adapt to it?
It wasn't so bad,
Wasn't?
and it
Okay.
wasn't so bad. We lived very close.
Uh-huh.
We lived very close. Blackstone, you will know. Blackstone and 58.
So
There is
it's a
a-
wonderful place.
58 is
Yeah.
the axis of the university,
Yeah.
right? So it was on Blackstone,
Yeah.
a pretty large building, and I was on the top floor, third floor, and I lived there for about 13 years, and then I built a house on the next,
Yes.
next, right.
Yeah.
It was a space between the two buildings, between this building and the next one was the university.
Who lives there now? Do you know?
There were people. There was a physics professor there under me, and I bought the parcel between this building and the next one was a student housing of the University of Chicago.
Right.
And there I built a small house. So it worked out perfectly well. I mean, it was my wife, my late wife, that moved mainly there, the house and so on. That was her
So the
her
times
work
in
more than
Chicago
mine. But
were
because
very, very happy times.
yeah, it was the happiest time of my life were in Chicago actually. Because I had a family, I had a nice house near short walk to
Yeah.
work. It was very nice.
Yeah.
I lost my wife last year to Parkinson. It was very hard, She didn't want to come here
Back to
very much, but and so I blame myself for moving so quickly and so on. But I had a good, she understood it too. She always went with me, I worked with Moore again at Columbia initially, but then everything fell apart for various reasons,
Yes.
And I didn't have, it wasn't very good until I got this job, which is a good one.
Right.
But I don't know for how long, in my age and so on. As long as I can, I do it.
Do you see any, we're going to run out of the film now. I
Yeah.
thought that I would just do can you sit for just a little bit?
No, I
Do
give
wanna
you all
go?
the time. I am very much interested in that.
Okay. Okay, so
As
I'm
long
gonna,
as you want
I'm going
me.
to turn this off and put in
Sure.
another roll
Sure.
of just
Sure.
probably another 20 minutes.
Good, good,
That's all.
good.
That's all.
But you must let me again to go and come.
In the office of Victor Zarnowitz on December 11th, 2001. And there are just a couple of questions that I thought that you would have some interesting responses to, which is, how do you see the function of the Bureau change in the time that you were the closest to it in the 50s, then into the 60s when you were returning to it from Chicago, forgetting about the more recent version of the Bureau with Marty, in which it has very much changed its function in a very deliberate way. But in the 50s and the 60s, do you see the function of the Bureau changing? And I mean that think about the relationship between the Bureau and the U.S. government, what one was doing, what the other one was doing, the relationship between the Bureau and other private operations. Is there any sense in which it changed?
Well, I know about the changes. Again, I was not involved in them directly. There were, of course, changes at the top. The presidents have changed. There was a kind of, it was a problem mainly because of people were not on the spot. First, Burns spent a lot of time in Washington, and then Moore left. Fabricant became more active. Moore left for also, became Commissioner of Bureau of Labor Statistics, and spent a lot of time in Washington. And there was some kind of an interregnum there. And Fuchs became active. Lipsy was active in administrative positions, but there's a lot of gaps to fill in. For example, I did fill in the gap left by Moore in business circles to some extent.
What about the function of the mission of the Bureau? Do you see any change in the mission?
That was not clear to me that there was a change in the mission of the Bureau. There was the same interest in research in more or less the same areas, same people, except that they have become kind of distracted by other jobs, mainly in government. And then Meyer came, Meyer and Co. The interest changed, of course, somewhat. I think there was probably less emphasis on business cycles as things developed. But there was still a good deal of interest in the area.
What can you say about
I think as far as relationship with government are concerned that you ask, there was an old rule that the Bureau was to be non-partisan and non-political in a sense, and that was observed generally. It was kind of in constitution of the Bureau, and that was observed by the successive administration of the Bureau, always, still observed, I believe. When the top person is actually active and has strong political views, will be very careful to speak in his own name or her own name rather than the NBER. That was always the case. There was a question. There were financial problems, of course, that the Bureau had, and that was finally resolved. Sort of resolved in the present Bureau rather than in the old one. The old one suffered from that time.
Of the Bureau, and when you were there, you were funded by the Bureau. The Bureau had
right. The Bureau had
money from the Ford Foundation
and from other for example, for the forecasting study, I guess it was Burns who raised the money, and the manufacturer of refrigerators, what was the name of the name? Big manufacturer of refrigerators gave money for that. So it was private money, it was private money. It was not just all Ford Foundation or or NSF or anything like that. So it was money from corporations where they could interest corporations in that. But it was very subdued. When I compare it, for example, with the conference board, it's much more active role, talking with business executives and so on of large corporations, asking for money, raising money in various ways, interesting them in what we are doing. There was much less of that was at least visible to staff members at the Bureau. Maybe because it was all much smaller, or maybe it was reserved to different people. Here it is not, Here I am asked to talk to groups of businessmen. I never had that at the Bureau.
Right.
That was not done, apparently.
So at the Bureau, you were never asked to write a proposal to...
Oh yes, yes, but it was
Okay.
all internal,
Right.
It was all internal. It was not very formal either, You did it, much of that was oral rather than in writing, I believe. So it was not very formalized, but you could interest people in this or that by talking with them. And you could write it. Of course, you wrote your contributions to the annual report each year.
Right.
Each one who had a project wrote it. That's how it worked, actually. I don't remember that it was much more than that.
Right. Now, I've now that I've received all of them, I've gone through many of them, and it's often sort of humorous to read a little blurb by yourself or Milton or Anna, in which they say, during the summer of 1961, I did the following.
Right.
A little blurb, or I have not made much progress on.
Right.
A little blurb.
Right. That's what we did. That was the progress we reported.
You know what I'm going to ask
gave
you?
was
Take
for...
the microphone is covered up.
Okay.
So, that's a little bit better. Thank you very much.
We
That's perfect.
talked a lot. As I say, much of that was informal, at least on the level I operated. Maybe it was formalized at a higher level, but I think that most of it found its way to the annual report, which actually staff members have written, and that was reviewed, but not very strongly. What I have written, I remember, was always accepted and published in the annual report. And that's why the annual report, I think, is a good source of seeing what we have been doing or
Right.
what we have failed in doing.
We're sort of we've sort of worked our way up in time, and you just mentioned Ed Koo and John Meyer.
Right.
So we're now into the 60s in the Bureau, and can you mention anything about what happens when when Ed Koo comes in? I think that there are also some changes in the machinery at the Bureau. We're getting, I think, hooked up to a mainframe.
Right. There was, of course, yes, the computer made its advent at the Bureau. Before then, even though there were changes, there were absences and therefore changes. I think Fabricant was active for a while, was really running the Bureau. But that was not much of a change in substance or in mission, as you call it, that I remember. It was very much the same. It was a continuation of what Mitchell, Burns, and Moore were doing before. It was little change, I believe, in substance. Now, with Meyer and Koo, there were more changes.
Okay.
There's definitely more change. But there was also, there was a good deal of continuity still. Fuchs was very, very active in administering the Bureau, right? And then he moved west also, right? That was his doing, I think, this Palo Alto branch. and he did it very much in the old way, I believe. Even Meyer and Cooper perhaps did it in the old way. At least the scale was similar. The main difference, I think, is that the Bureau was much smaller, the projects were much fewer, and very, very few and distinct, and everything was more or less centralized. People were on the spot and working on the spot, or if they left, let's say, to a university, they continued more or less on the same project, and they would rather frequently appear in New York and again talk about that or present the findings and so on. And later, of course, it became much, much bigger and much more decentralized.
So
In terms of projects, in terms of funding, I believe also, because people raised their money at the Bureau, through the Bureau, but on their own, more or less. And that was not before the case.
Right, and that was a very, very big change. But
right.
What were your feelings, or what was your sense when you discovered that John Meyer would be the new head of the Bureau?
Well, I didn't know him well. I learned to know him pretty soon, and even though it was different, it was still, I would say, there was still much the same thing as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Did you
Same
get the sense that Arthur had been pushed out, kindly maneuvered out?
Well, no, I didn't, and I simply I may be wrong. Maybe he was, but I was given to understand. I think we were given to understand that it was, that it was the other way around. That Burns found Meyer and installed him, and that may or may not be the case. I just don't know.
I don't know either. Actually.
No, I don't think it was. I really
I'll
don't
ask
think.
John.
Right. No. My impression is that Burns was looking for somebody and found Meyer. That's my impression.
Uh-huh.
Now, how Meyer ended up, I again don't know really. I don't know exactly. These were, if there were intrigues or some things at the top. I was no, and I didn't know. Maybe I would have cared, but I never knew about it. Never was told anything. So no.
Uh-huh.
No, but what I was told, what I understood is definitely that it didn't come from Meyer throwing Burns out. That it was the other way around. That's what I meant.
Right. I didn't think that Meyer threw Burns out, but that the board decided that it would be best if Burns were not there, and that
Could
there
be.
should be someone new.
There was definitely the case, some case for it, I believe, because Burns was simply not there, and you cannot, if you want. Right.
But of course, he was then very fortunate in some sense, because the next year he is selected as the head of the Federal Reserve.
Well, yeah, there are very mixed views on how he did
There are very mixed reviews on how he did.
All right.
And you were at Chicago at the time, and
he didn't have very good reviews at
he
Chicago.
didn't have very good reviews. And Milton, who had been very close with Arthur,
Right.
breaks with him.
Right. This
Do you
I know.
remember that?
Again, I know it, but I was not involved in that at all in any way. Neither Milton or Arthur told me anything about it directly. So no, but I know how they felt, because this was general knowledge, and of course we talked. So I know that Milton was unhappy with Burns. This I knew directly, yes. But what happened between the two directly, I don't know, How he broke with him. I heard about that he broke with him, but...
I think that it was because of wage and price controls. That it
Right,
came
right,
very
right. I mean, this
late.
is anathema in Chicago, you know that. and
Yes.
and for Milton probably in particular. So no surprise there, right? What is surprising is that Burns um, did was not more decisively against inflation, against the threat of inflation. That is somewhat surprising because I think he would. But I think it's probably it might have been the attention to business cycle situation, but precisely the background in business cycles that caused that, Inflation was important as a threat and so on, but business cycle recession was an even bigger, right, problem.
I think that's
that might explain it.
good insight, and I think that it's an important issue to resolve.
Right.
Why Arthur let inflation go, which was
Right.
his downfall.
His downfall, right. I saw last Arthur Burns on a national airport in Washington by chance, and he was already ambassador to Germany, and we talked right, and we talked briefly and so on, but nothing. I can report nothing particularly interesting.
I met him, I think, only once, and I think it was in the 80s, and I was on a panel in a conference, and he came very late because he was a very important person. And he came into the room, sat down next to me. He had missed all the presentations and then had to get up and give a summary. And he looked at me and he said, tell me what has happened. And he leaned over and I gave him some cogent commentary on it. He thanked me. He stood up. He went to the podium. He said some remarkably fine words. He sat down and...
What do you mean by fine words?
I think that he summarized, he brought history to bear on it. I dimly recall that I sat back and thought, how did he make so much sense of what I said?
No, he was a bright man. There's
Yes,
no question about it.
but he was also, what I find interesting, and people have said this to me, Anna said this to me, Anna said, the men hated him, they despised him, the women loved him.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking to myself at the time, way back in the 80s, what a charming individual. And Anna essentially said, the women were charmed by him, but the men despised him.
I met her only once at Moore. Moore lived in Watergate, actually.
Yes.
Both had apartments in the Watergate. Moore was the commissioner of BLS. I was in Washington on some business, and Burns came over, and we had a good evening. We ate and so on, and he had a charming wife.
Burns
Burns,
did.
right.
Yeah.
And I felt and so on. I didn't know them well, but they were all charmed by her. They all loved her, Moore and everyone. And he was not necessarily liked very much. He didn't. He may not have cared. He was overbearing. He was difficult. But I have only, as it happens, it's all chance. I never had any friction with him or anything. Quite the contrary. I was surprised and very pleased when he asked me, because I know that it meant something for him. After all, he was asked to do it, and he said he has written too much about the man, which I understand, about Mitchell, and he asked me, so I was very pleased. And of course he read it, and he approved of it. And I don't know what would happen if he did, maybe he would show his bedside then. But I never knew his bedside directly. But I know about it, because as I say, Ruth complained bitterly about him.
Yes, well, I think a lot of people complain bitterly about him. And it was also perhaps the comparison. Mitchell was wonderful to everybody.
Yeah, this I heard, right.
And he was
Yeah.
kind, gentle, loving, every
Right.
every good word
Right.
that's been
You
used
see,
to
now
describe
I
him.
knew several people at the bureau who looked to me to be like that. Definitely Moore. Moore was very kind, a very good man, a very good man. He may have had, intellectually may not have been the same caliber, but and some people thought so, and even gave him to understand that, for example, Sol Fabricant did, and I was sort of taken aback by that. But and that was my impression. That is what I know about the man. He was a very kind and friendly and humane man. Moore was.
You
Uh,
mentioned that Gideon Rosenbluth is still in New York City, right?
no, he was in Vancouver,
Oh, I'm sorry. So
Canada.
he's in
Teaching there.
Vancouver
Right,
now.
right. I saw him fairly recently on some occasion in
I'm
meetings
just
somewhere.
saying, maybe
No,
if I
no.
get out to
He
Vancouver,
get back.
I'll
Right.
interview him.
Yeah, he might. And then you should. I tell you what. I'll make it a point. And
Someone named Ray.
I will try to uncover and look
Okay.
up the annual reports.
Okay.
Or maybe can you do
Well,
it? I
sure.
don't know where I have
all
them.
of them now.
If I did it, I could tell you a good deal more. I would
Well,
remember
I can
what
call you
the
up.
names. I could tell
Right.
you who to contact.
Let's do the following. Let's end this. I'll pack it up, and then as we do that, we'll talk a bit more. But are there any? You've said so much, and I don't know if there's any final comment that you want to make to this tape. If there's anything that we left out.
As I said before, I liked very much the bureau as it was, and maybe that colors my reminiscences. But that's how it is. I felt at home at the bureau, almost from the beginning. That's why I came back. That's why I was actually somewhat reluctant to leave. But of course, I left because it was the thing to do. In almost every respect, financially too. We were not very well paid at the bureau, and that was one thing. But the fact that people generally, I believe, felt well and stayed with the bureau despite that, and despite other things, like, for example, there was probably on the part certainly of Burns and so on. I wasn't involved in that, but it probably existed, this sense of hierarchy, a sense of I'm here and you are here and so on. But other than that, and I worked with Moore who didn't have that, I felt that there's remarkably little of it, and that the atmosphere is good and people like to work. And they work very, very hard. And of course, it was also the sense that you work with people who do their best, and their best is really very good.
Right.
People like Friedman or Kuznets or Stigler and so on. They were giants, and they are still, in a sense, in what they are doing. And so I like that, obviously. I felt it. And that was the good thing about it. And that is, in a sense, and I regret it very much, lost in the present bureau through fault of no one. It's not, it's simply the size and the evolution of the bureau and the decentralization and so on. There are still probably very, very good people, excellent people working on their stuff, but they are not together, and that makes a difference.
Well, you must come and visit me there, because there is a core group who are together.
Yeah.
Some of us are on leave for the year. We're there. We talk together. We work together.
They may be very
eat
similar.
together.
That may be very similar.
It's similar in some respects. In one respect, it isn't, which is that we're each working on our own project. They're not as integrated as set of
Well,
projects.
that I think needs to be corrected. I mean, there was integration in the sense that there were meetings in which we talked about our own project, and the others from other projects intervened, sometimes very actively. They liked it or not, and so on. They were outspoken on that. But otherwise, it was a separation by
Right.
projects, very clearly, you know. So it was not so that, and they didn't have the sense that they know all about the other projects, you know, that they are really
Right.
all-knowing and so on. No, I mean, there was a good deal of specialization in the sense. But now my impression is much more yet of that, because there's a greater diversity and
There's a
greater
huge-
size.
I mean,
Huge.
there's a huge diversity.
Right.
There's no question. But let me just end this tape with a proposal that Victor Zarnowitz come and have lunch with us at the bureau and join in the conversation. Okay.
You mean in Cambridge?
In Cambridge.
Oh, in Cambridge. Good. Thank you very much.
Too easy to go to New York.
Because we do go
'Cause I
sometimes,
know,
you know.
I
Yeah,
realize
right.
it. Okay, I'm going to turn this off now.